A millionaire was walking through the trees near his home when he heard a strange sound coming from the bushes. As he got closer, he looked around in fear because the first cry, which cut through the silence like a knife, caught his eye. Thomas Shelton stopped in the middle of the step and strained to listen with his head turned back. At first, he thought he was dreaming because the wind was blowing through the trees and making him feel strange. Then there was another cry, this one thin and sad, clearly human. His heart beat faster. He turned his head toward the sound and looked through the thick brush with sharp eyes. The woods around his property went on for miles and were wild, dark, and not interested in what was going on outside. There should be no one here. A third cry, this one weak and ending. Thomas moved forward, and the ground beneath his leather shoes sank. He didn't even notice that the road was uneven and full of broken branches and tangled roots. His mind was racing with the worst possible scenarios: a desperate woman leaving her newborn baby, or a hurt hiker stuck in the woods without any help. Then he saw it. It was tucked away in the tangled brush, just barely hidden by a rough layer of twigs and leaves. A basket, a cheap, worn-out wicker basket with ends that are frayed and soft from being wet, and inside were 3 babies. Thomas let out a sharp breath, and the air stuck in his throat. They were wrapped in thin, worn-out blankets that didn't protect them from the cold that was seeing them come. One of them, a boy with a dark hair tuft, let out another soft whimper. His little hands shook from the cold. He knelt down and asked, "Who the hell would do this?" While his hands hovered over the wet blankets for a moment, their skin was red from being out in the cold, and their limbs were stiff from trying to stay warm. When his fingers touched a tiny palm, one of the babies automatically grabbed his finger with all the desperate strength of something that wouldn't let go. He felt a strange tightness in his chest. He took a deep breath. There was a hint of rain in the wind as it whispered through the leaves. We couldn't waste any time. It took Thomas a long time to carefully lift the box. Not only did it feel heavy on his body, but what he was holding seemed to have a strong pull on his bones. He stood up straight and looked around, looking for anything that might help him figure out who had left these things there, like tracks or things that had been thrown away. Nothing, only the forest, which was very big and didn't care about him, told him secrets he couldn't understand. The woods had always been a quiet place for him, a getaway from the luxury of his estate, and a place where he could breathe without the weight of demand suffocating him. His jaw tensed up. There wasn't really a choice to be made. Putting the basket back in his arms, he turned around and went back to the house. He could feel the cold, but not very much. He already knew what this meant, who to call, and how to take care of them. No matter what had brought these kids into his life, it would never be the same again. There were lanterns along the edge of the yard. They flickered in the wind, throwing broken beams of light on his sharp features. After a long day, another meeting with fake handshakes and nice words, and another night in a house that was too big for one man, these 3 boys showed up. When he let out a breath, the cold air made him more aware, but it wasn't enough to ease the pain in his ribs. With the 3 babies in his arms, Thomas walked through the trees and looked over his shoulder one last time. He could hear nothing as the night closed in around him. Someone, somewhere, knows what they did, and one day that someone may come look for what they left behind. The night pressed against the big windows of the Shelton house and blocked out the sound of the world outside. It looked like a storm was coming, and the sky was swollen with clouds that were rolling around like waves on an unsteady sea. When Thomas pushed open the heavy oak doors, the cold evening air rushed in, mixing with the warmth of the grand hall. Donna had been a maid for the Shelton family for almost 30 years. She was shocked when she heard the sound of hurried footsteps and gasped for air when she saw her boss. The big Thomas stood in the doorway, tense. His dark coat was dirty with leaves and mud, but it wasn't his messy appearance that stopped Donna in her tracks. It was what he was carrying. 3 babies were tucked up against his chest and wrapped in blankets that had more holes than fabric. You could just barely see their faces through the torn ends. One moved, and a soft whimper came out of lips that were shaking. "My God," she said in a low voice. Thomas took a step forward, but the dim light from the chandelier made it impossible to read his face. Donna saw it, though, the weight of something new pressing against him. "Get the fire going," he said in a steady but tired voice. "They're freezing." Donna didn't think twice. She quickly moved towards a large living room as her shock turned into habit. Putting logs on top of the embers until the flames came back to life helped her build muscle memory. When Thomas with the babies on the soft couch, the room was already getting warmer, which hurt their skin that had been frozen. "What happened?" Donna ordered as she kneeled next to the youngest of the three and looked for signs of illness. Her voice was a mix of shock and urgency. "Where on earth did you find them?" "The forest," Thomas said in a low voice as he threw off his wet coat. "Someone left them there in a basket." When Donna looked up, her hand stopped on the baby's chest, showing how worn they were. "Left them?" The words were bad to taste. Thomas looked at her with a tight jaw. "Abandoned them." They didn't say anything for a long time. The room was silent except for the crackle of the fire and the baby's whimpers. Then Donna picked herself up, shook herself free, and marched towards the kitchen. She called over her shoulder, "If you're waiting for me to break down, you'll be waiting all night. These babies need to eat." Thomas felt something in his chest as he watched her go. He had known Donna for years. She was loyal, bluntly honest, and quick-witted, but he could count on her. She had been in charge of a crazy staff and ran the house like a seasoned general. But this wasn't like that. The tone was private. At the time she came back, she had carefully balanced a tray on her arm with 3 small bottles of warm milk that she had quickly filled. Thomas got one from her. "Here," she told him, and her firm voice made it impossible for him to argue. "Keep the baby's head up. Just back it up like that." Thomas had never missed a beat when he was negotiating billion-dollar deals, speaking at world conferences, or dealing with angry boardrooms. He felt completely useless as he stumbled with the bottle and tried to get in the right place. He remembered that the baby, whose name was Simon and whose small name tag was just barely hanging off the torn blanket, made a noise and moved to protest. "You're too tense," Donna said in a low voice as she reached over to loosen his grip. "Babies feel that. Take it easy." It took Thomas a moment to calm down and take a slow breath. Just then, Simon grabbed the bottle and wrapped his little fingers around Thomas's hand to feel safe. Thomas felt something move in his chest. The room was quiet for a long time, except for the soft sounds of the baby sucking. Donna worked carefully, feeding one baby after another. She did this with the kind of skill that could only come from years of experience. Thomas paid close attention to how she held her hands, as she slowly slid the bottle down and whispered something comforting to herself. He said, "You've done this before." Donna took too long to answer, so she just said, "A long time ago." She usually has armor that can't be broken through, but Thomas didn't press the issue. As soon as the last baby was done eating, Donna carefully cleaned their mouths and put them on the couch to stay warm, covering them with new blankets. She stood up straight and put her hands on her hips. "We need answers." Thomas slowly let out a breath while still holding Simon. "I have the security team searching the estate," he stated. "They're looking for footprints, tire tracks, anything that might tell us where they came from." Donna made a face and crossed her arms. "No, there is no sign of a mother. Nothing." She turned her head away. Whoever did this, they weren't careless. That thought sank deep between them. Long shadows went across the room as the fire flickered. Thomas looked at the babies and kept asking himself questions that he couldn't answer. Someone left 3 babies in the middle of the woods. Why would they do that? Why did this feel like it wasn't over? He put Simon down and adjusted the cover over him. His house felt different as he did this. For many years, the Shelton estate had been quiet. It was a beautiful, empty haven. But tonight, the peace felt living and full. Thomas wasn't sure if he liked it for the first time in a long time. When the storm finally broke outside, it rained hard on the windows and thunder rolled across the sky. The past was moving around out in the night. It would soon knock on the door. The rain hit the high windows of the Shelton house in a steady rhythm that mixed with the sound of 3 babies sleeping and the fireplace crackling. The storm was at its worst, and the wind was lashing at the trees outside the estate grounds, forcing them to bend in desperate, violent arcs. The warmth inside was thick and wrapped around the grand entrance like an invisible cocoon. Thomas was sitting at his desk in the study. The oak panel walls were lit by a single desk lamp, which made long shadows. He didn't do anything while his fingers lay on a whiskey glass. He wasn't thinking about the report that was nicely stacked next to him. That night in the woods was 2 months ago. 2 months ago, he took 3 abandoned children into his home, thinking that the situation would only last for a short time and that he could quickly and cheaply fix it. Things were different now. He had changed because of Simon, Peter, and Shah. He knew all their different cries. The sharp wails of hunger, the soft hiccuping sobs of exhaustion, and the odd stubborn protests when one wouldn't go to sleep. When someone held him, he knew which one curled his little fingers into his shirt. It was Peter, which one often got out from under his blankets. Simon, and who always fell asleep first. Shah. Thomas used to feel empty in his own home, but now he was hearing for them. He would stop in the hallways without meaning to in order to make sure he could still hear their soft breathing from the nursery. He ought to have felt weighed down, but he didn't. In the evening, the smell of broth cooking filled the grand halls of the Shelton house and made the dark kitchen feel extra warm. Thomas stood at the stove with his sleeves rolled up to his elbows and carefully ladled soup into a bowl. The only sound was soft bubbling until a chair creaked. Donna sat at the island counter with her arms crossed and looked at him with a face that was somewhere between shock and laughter. Finally, she tapped her fingers on the marble and asked, "Are you ready to cook now?" Thomas grinned, but he didn't look up. Apparently, Donna was angry. First, you start getting home before it gets dark. Then you cancel talks because something comes up with family. You're cooking now. She stopped and her eyes got narrow. Who are you, and what have you done with Thomas Shelton? After a quiet laugh, he put the bowl on the counter in front of her. I have no idea what you're talking about. She raised an eyebrow and took the spoon. Of course not. The house, which used to be a cold fortress, had changed into a home. That wasn't something he said out loud. He kept himself busy cleaning the counter while watching Donna eat. He let the moment become familiar and comfortable. The knock came next. It was weak and hesitant, and it was almost too soft to hear over the stove's pilot light. Donna's spoon stopped in the air. Thomas turned his attention to the lounge. They weren't ready for anyone. He felt a chill go down his spine for a split second. The past was making noise. Thomas used a dish towel to wipe his hands and then walked toward the door, with Donna right behind him. It got dark in the foyer, and the chandelier above made long shadows on the shiny floors. This time the knock was weak and unsure. Thomas opened the door. On the entryway, a woman stood up almost straight. The dim flashlight flashed on her bruised and swollen face, drawing attention to the deep cuts along her cheekbone, the crack split in her lower lip, and the way her collarbone stuck out from under her wet, torn dress. Her eyes, which were wide, hollow, and desperate, only looked at Thomas for a second before moving to the playpen in the corner of the living room, where the babies were sleeping. She gasped for air, and then she fell down. It was like her body had only been able to hold itself together long enough to get here. The woman let out a gasp, but Thomas was already on the move and caught her before she hit the wet stone. Her skin was as cold as ice, and her body was too light for her. When he put his fingers on her wrist, her pulse was irregular and weak. He said, "Help me," and then he picked her up and carried her across the doorway. Donna locked the door behind them, so the storm couldn't get in. "Dorothy," he said in a low voice. She wasn't known to him. He didn't know who she was, why she was here, or what she wanted. But as he carried her through the house, past the sleeping babies, she had looked at like she knew them forever. He couldn't get rid of the feeling that everything she'd been through had brought her back to them. And this night, which he thought would end in silence, was about to reveal a truth he wasn't sure he was ready for. Donna got down on her knees next to the unconscious woman as Thomas put her on the couch. She was checking on her injuries. Dorothy moved just as she touched the woman's face with her soft, wet hair. She spoke her first word, which was a name. Simon. Thomas stopped moving. She knew them. That was it. The questions that had been bothering him for months were no longer questions. The past was finally at his door. The big storm was over, but the night still had the smell of it. Rain fell from the roof of the Shelton house in a slow, steady rhythm that broken up the stillness inside. The living room fire was low and flashing, as if it were a reflection of how tired everyone was. Dorothy lay still in the guest bedroom. Her breathing was all over the place, and her fingers moved back and forth on the soft cotton sheets. She wasn't gentle when she moved. It happened quickly, and her body jerked as if she were waking up from a bad dream. She slowly opened her eyes and got used to the dim light from a lamp next to her bed. The roof above was strange. It was too high, too clean, and too safe. It wasn't her job to feel safe. When she sat up too quickly, her ribs hurt like hell. A sharp breath came out of her mouth. Careful, Dorothy quickly turned her attention to the door. Donna stood there with her arms crossed and a hot tea mug in one hand. It was impossible to read her face. It was cold, wary, and calculated, but not mean. She moved forward and put the tea on the nightstand. Drink. It will make the pain go away. Dorothy was unsure, itched to grab the cup, but her instincts had been telling her for years not to accept free kindness. Donna sighed and sat down in the chair across from the bed, as if she could feel the battle going on inside her. I'm not going to inquire about what took place. Not yet, she said in a calm voice. I cleaned your cuts and put a bandage on your ribs, so you're lucky nothing is broken. You look like you haven't slept in weeks, you're hungry, and you have a fever. It hurt Dorothy's throat to swallow. Donna quickly added, I'm not going to ask you what happened. She put up a hand. No talking until you drink. Dorothy thought about it again, and then she finally put her hand around the mug. She could feel the heat in her skin as she brought it to her lips. It made her fingers shake. It wasn't much, but it felt good. That was enough to almost break her. Thomas just sat in the chair by the fireplace and watched her. He didn't say anything or try to get close to her. He was keeping his normal cool, which was sharp and detached, like a man who was on top of the world. But something had changed below it. Negotiating with cruel businessmen for years, he had to sit across from men who lied like it was nothing. He could tell when someone was lying, and Dorothy wasn't lying. Her throat was sore when she finally spoke. The babies, they're asleep. Thomas didn't say anything. Her face lit up with relief, so quickly that it could have been made up. She put the tea down and let out a shaky breath. She asked, You took care of them? He just said, They were left behind. She answered, I didn't have much of a choice, and she let out a small, funny laugh. You had every choice, he told her, letting her words fall on him. Donna shook her head and crossed her arms. She asked, Who are you? Dorothy looked at the ground for a moment as she pressed her fingers against the warm ceramic of the mug. It looked like she wanted to go away. Then, in short, quiet words, she began to talk. She said, My dad bet a lot. It sounded more like a curse than an answer when she said it. Dorothy's grip on the mug got tighter. He owed a lot of money, and it never ended. He bet more than he could ever pay back, and when the stakes got too high, he sold everything he owned. She took a deep breath in and out. And one day, that meant me. It shouldn't have been so simple to say the words, but it was. Thomas didn't move, but Donna took a sharp breath in. Dorothy looked past him with blurry eyes because she was thinking about things she couldn't get rid of. He sold me to a criminal named Jason. Strong, dangerous, and impossible touch. Her voice was shaky. At first, I thought I was supposed to be some kind of collateral, that maybe my father won big enough. He could buy me back. When she laughed, it was a hollow, crackly sound. I was naive. Thomas leaned forward and put his arms on his knees. When he spoke, it was quiet but firm. How long? Dorothy's hands were clenched in her lap. Donna said something under her breath that sounded a lot like a prayer. 5 years. Dorothy's eyes got darker. It was clear that he owed me in every way. He was mean some days and worse other days. But I learned how to stay alive. I thought that maybe if I was careful, quiet, and obeyed enough. She stopped and blinked quickly, as if she didn't want to break. Thomas didn't turn away. And the babies? Dorothy's lips moved apart. But at first she didn't say anything. Then there was a whisper. One night I heard him. Her fingers were shaking as she swallowed. He never wanted them, she said in a voice that was barely audible. He was waiting for me to give birth, and then he was going to sell them. Keep quiet. Not the empty kind, but the kind that was full of something sharp, thick, and smothering. Thomas's pale fingers got tighter as he gripped the armrest of his chair. Dorothy looked at him at last. That's why I ran. The wind howled outside. I did not speak until the house was empty. I grabbed them, wrapped them in what I had, and ran into the woods. I believed I could go far enough. I thought. Her voice broke. He found me. Donna, who had been still up until now, grabbed the table edge so hard that her palms turned white. Dorothy looked down, like she felt bad about what she did. I had to leave them. I put them in the bushes, so he wouldn't find them. I then ran the other way, letting them catch me instead. Thomas's heart was beating fast in his ears. And Jason? Dorothy's face changed into something that looked a bit like it was haunted. He almost killed me. The room fell into a long silence. Thomas's jaw tightened, and he felt something strange in his body. Anger. That is, not just at Jason, but at the world that let this happen. The room felt too small all of a sudden. Dorothy let out a shaky breath, and her voice pushed him back. I didn't know if they were still alive. Now her eyes were wet and sparkled with a weak sense of relief. I hope someone. This house is close to the woods. When I rang the doorbell, you were there. Thomas looked at her for a long time before he finally got up. Donna looked back and forth, not sure what to do. Thomas turned his attention to the fireplace and stared into flames as if he were looking for answers. His voice was deadly when he talked. Jason won't touch them again. Dorothy stopped moving and her breath shook. Something about the way he said it, calm, sure, and absolute, quite scared her. They were telling her the truth for the first time since she came into the house. The weight of Dorothy's story filled the room like a storm. Thomas knew that this wasn't over yet. The past is about to catch up with them, and Jason is still out there. The fire in the study was very low, giving the room a flashing amber light of light. The storm outside was over, but the sound of its fury was still in the air. The wind would sometimes howl through the trees, and raindrops would softly patter against the windows. With one hand on the mantel and the other on the far end of the room, Thomas stood and stared into the dying flames. His mouth was tight. There was a slight smell of tea in the cup that was still sitting on the side table, untouched. The smell of wet earth and burn would mix together. Dorothy's words had become heavy and immovable in the empty space between them. Jason won't touch them again. It wasn't a danger. It did not mean anything. It was true. That being said, even though he was sure, doubt kept creeping around the edges of his thoughts. He had spent years figuring out how to spot lies that were hidden behind carefully chosen words. He saw people use their disasters as weapons and manipulate them. What if she was not telling the truth? What if this was just another carefully planned show to take advantage of any weak connection he had made with these kids without realizing it? Then he heard a very quiet sound, a rustling, that was just loud enough to wake him up. He turned around. Dorothy was uncertain as she stood in the doorway barefoot. In the too big nightgown Donna had given her, she looked smaller than she had before. The dim light made the shadows under her eyes stand out even more, and she still felt incredibly tired. She wasn't here to trick him. She lost everything and had nothing left to gain. A small cry broke the quiet before he could speak. Dorothy tensed up. Thomas breathed out. They're in the nursery. She didn't think about it for long before she turned around. As she followed the sound, her bare feet tapped softly on the floor. The nursery wasn't very bright. The wall lanterns gave off a soft golden glow that made the room feel warm and cozy. There was a little rocking in the corner chair, like someone had just been there. Sitting in the middle of it all, wrapped in soft blankets in a cot, was Simon. He had turned over on his side and clenched his little hands together as he let out another sleepy whimper. His body was moving around restlessly on the mattress. Dorothy stood still in front of the door for a long time. She was still and didn't breathe. Then she walked inside, as if being pulled there by something bigger than herself. Thomas stood outside the room and watched. Dorothy knelt down next to the cot. She reached out slowly and carefully, her fingers shaking. It was just a light touch on Simon's cheek. As soon as her skin touched, he stopped moving and his tiny body relaxed. It was like he had been waiting and knew. Dorothy let out a breath that was shaky and broken. She then spoke in a whisper that Thomas could barely hear. Simon. The way her mouth felt when she spoke his name was raw and clear. Before she could stop herself, She let out a sob. She put her hand over her mouth as if she were trying to hold the feeling back. It was too late, though. She broke. She wasn't quiet like she had been taught, not in the controlled way she had worked on for years. She broke down. It looked like the room wasn't big enough to hold all of it. The sadness, the joy, the fear, and the love. It filled the quiet with something unbearable as it spread into the air and the spaces between them. Thomas's hands turned into a fist. That level of pain could not be faked. Nobody. The soft crying of Dorothy was still going on when Thomas finally spoke. "Stay here." Her breath shook. She turned around with a look of shock on her face. "For now," he said again, his voice lower, "until we figure out what happens next." She spoke up as if she were going to fight or expect to be rebuffed. But they didn't say anything because there was no more to argue about. That choice had already been made. She just nodded, and her fingers were still curled up on Simon's blanket. She let herself believe, just for a moment, that she wasn't alone for the first time in years. The city light went all the way to the horizon, giving the dark streets an eerie glow. As you walked into a dimly lit lounge, cigarette smoke curled up and up towards the sky. There was a strong, thick smell of old whiskey in the air. In his free time, Jason leaned back in his chair and tapped a glass of whiskey in front of him. The room was filled with low talk, but he didn't really notice it. He was no longer able to wait. It was supposed to be a party at the end of the night. Another deal closed, another pocket stuffed. One phone call, though, destroyed it. Dorothy was gone, and she took his things with her. He squeezed the glass harder and harder until the ice inside broke. A man across the table said she couldn't have gotten far, moving awkwardly in Jason's eyes. Jason didn't say anything. He slowly let out a breath through his nose while his jaw worked. Of course she wasn't very far away. Dorothy was a bother, a risk, an oversight that he should have fixed sooner. She wasn't stupid, though. She knew what would happen if she ran away. She knew what he was able to do. She had done it anyway. As soon as he realized it, a sharp pain shot up his back. "Find her," Jason told her in a steady, quiet, and scary voice. "I'll do whatever it takes. I need her back." "And the kids?" someone asked with some doubt. Jason smiled slowly and very sharply. "They belong to me." Then another colleague walked in, and more information fell into his lap. "Douglas has returned." I laughed, Jason. The jerk from the past came back to town with cash. It was almost too simple. People come and go. He put down his glass and said, "This family is very interesting." He had a slow smile on his face. "Douglas may think he is free of his past, but bills always come back to haunt you. He's not going to make it out alive this time." The days that followed were a surprise. Dorothy didn't wake up scared because it was quiet for the first time in years. Even though she had broken old habits, she still got up early. But instead of the gut-wrenching fear of Jason's presence, she woke up to the smell of coffee wafting down the hall, Donna moving around the kitchen in a quiet way, the baby's muffled giggles as they stirred in their cot, and Thomas Shelton's voice, low and measured, but sometimes softened with something almost gentle when he spoke to the kids. She did not know how to feel about him. He wasn't like guys like Jason or her dad. He was unique. His power wasn't based on fear. It wasn't about being in charge. It was an obvious force that didn't ask for anything but controlled everything. The little things were the first things she noticed. For example, he would stay a little longer while watching the babies. He started coming home earlier and spending more time here instead of at work, and she walked into the kitchen one cold morning to find him cooking. She was frozen in the hallway, not sure she was awake or dreaming. Donna didn't even look up while she was reading a newspaper at the bar. She said in a low voice, "Don't look so shocked. This has been going on for weeks." Thomas, who was always calm, didn't bother to explain when Dorothy looked at him with wide eyes. He just slid a plate towards her instead. "Bacon, eggs, and toast." "Eat," he told her. Yes, she did. She ate without worrying about what would happen for the first time in years. She didn't know how she got into this life, where a man like Thomas Shelton wasn't asking anything from her. She didn't know what to do with it, but she didn't want to run. Not yet. The house was quiet that night. Little bodies were tucked under warm blankets to make the babies feel at ease. The soft crackling of the fireplace in the living room lit up the deep oak floors with golden light. Dorothy curled up in a sofa and stared into the flames. It felt like the first time in a long time that she wasn't tight with worry. Then her phone went off. She couldn't get her breath out. That sound hadn't been heard in too long. The number was hard for her to remember, but the name, Douglas. Her face lost all of its blood. She stared at the screen, and the past came flooding back to her like a rough tide. The room became too hot, too loud, and too smothering, and her fingers squished together around the phone. Dorothy. Thomas slowly called her name, and she realized she had stopped breathing. She looked around. He was looking at her from near the fireplace. His cold, sharp eyes moved the phone she was holding. Seeing. That's right. He didn't push, though. Dorothy took a swallow while her hand lingered over the screen. Then she said no to the call. The phone stopped ringing. She put it on the table and pushed it away as if it were hot. Thomas didn't say anything, but she could still feel his presence for one more second before he turned back to fire. Dorothy let out a shaky breath and brought her knees up to her chest. Now her dad was here, and he had a need. She still didn't know what it was. It had been a long, quiet night on the estate. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and burning wood. Inside, there was a silence that comes before something that is going to happen. Dorothy had passed out in the living room while curled up under a blanket that Donna had put over her earlier. The fire felt warm against her face, and Thomas had never seen her face look so soft while she was sleeping. He needed to be asleep hours ago, but was awake for some reason. The quiet was broken by a soft cry. Thomas got up before he even thought about it. It was dark in the hallway, so he walked past the guest rooms, past the big windows that looked out over the peaceful grounds, and towards a nursery. He knew something was wrong as soon as he walked in. Peter was fussy in his cot. His little body was hot under his blanket, and his breathing was short and irregular. A fever. Thomas made a face and put the back of his hand on the baby's forehead. It's too warm. It's too warm. Dorothy was still not awake. She was in her room. And Thomas Shelton had no idea what to do for the first time in his life. He was by himself with this. He wasn't the type to freeze, though. He was careful as he took Peter in his arms. The baby barely whimpered against his chest, and his little fingers curled into Thomas's shirt. "It's okay," Thomas said in a voice that wasn't normally so soft. "I got you," he said as he sat down in a rocking chair and held the baby against him while he reached for the wet cloth Donna had left earlier. It seemed like hours went by quickly. Thomas didn't go anywhere. He held Peter against him and gently cooled his fevered skin with the damp cloth. He whispered quiet, comforting words and rocked the baby slowly back and forth as his breathing stayed steady. They were both too tired to keep going at some point. When morning came, Thomas was still sitting in the chair with his back arched and Peter curled up against his chest. They were both sound asleep. When Dorothy woke up, the windows in the living room were filled with golden light, and the sound of birds in the distance broke the quiet. The warmth of the sheets was still on her skin as she stretched. It felt like something was off. Then Donna walked in with a fresh pot of coffee. She stood in the hallway for a moment and looked over at Dorothy, just saying, "You should go to the nursery." Dorothy took a quick blink. "Why?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. It hurt Dorothy's heart as she quickly pushed the blanket off and ran down the hall. She stopped when she got to the nursery. She gasped for air when she saw what she saw. Thomas, the cool, collected millionaire who used to look at the situation with cold, analytical distance, was already asleep. Peter also fell asleep in his arms, tucked against him. His fever had finally gone away. Dorothy couldn't move for a short time. She felt something change inside her, but she wasn't sure what it was. Her voice was quiet behind her. She said in a low voice, the baby wouldn't settle. Only Thomas was awake. The whole night, he held him. Dorothy swallowed even though her throat felt tight all of a sudden. Whatever the reason was, seeing Thomas like this, not guarded, safe, and open, felt like a holy sight that shouldn't be disrupted. She thought about Thomas Shelton for the first time. Who was he when no one was looking? In the evening, Dorothy sat by the window and looked at her phone. The last few calls she didn't answer, but when the screen came back on, she thought about it. Douglas. She felt sick just hearing the name. She didn't mean to answer, but she did. Hello. The other end was silent. Then Dorothy heard her dad's voice screech through the speaker, like it was full of something that she couldn't make out. You're alive. She shut her eyes and squeezed the phone even more. What do you want? A dry laugh. Right to the point. The same as your mom. Dorothy clenched her teeth. I have money now, Douglas said. That's enough to fix it, to make everything right. I can pay Jason back and get you out of this mess. Her heart beat fast. She said in a whisper, I don't need you to save me. Doug let out a sigh. I know I've made mistakes. Made mistakes. Dorothy yelled and her voice shook. You sold me. Keep quiet. A softer voice then said, I didn't know what else to do. Dorothy closed her eyes because her chest hurt. It was too simple not to believe him. It was too easy to think that he felt bad about what he did. He still thought of her as his daughter. Dorothy, he said again, but this time was quieter. Let me fix this. She ought to have hung up. She ought to have left. She didn't, though, because he was still her father after everything. She still wanted to believe in him, even though it was broken. Thomas reacted right away when Dorothy told him about the call. No. She made a face and crossed her arms. You don't even know what I was going to say. Thomas told her, say you're going to tell me you want to listen to him, that you want to believe he means it this time. Dorothy took a swallow. He said he could fix it. Thomas took a deep breath and ran his hand through his hair. It's too convenient, he said in a low voice. Jason is looking for you, and all of a sudden, your dad comes up with cash. What's wrong with you? She meant to, but she didn't. I don't know, she said. But what if? There was less noise from Thomas as he walked closer. What if he's lying? Dorothy looked into his eyes and, for the first time, didn't know what to say. Do you think Dorothy's choice was wrong? Do you agree? If so, please leave a comment below. The air at night felt heavier than normal, and the way it pressed against his state was a sign. The chandelier's dim light just barely reached the corners of the grand hall, where it cast long, broken shadows. Dorothy stood still and looked at Jason and her dad, who were standing on the front door. Her heart was pounding in her chest. The past had come back. Douglas didn't look like he did in her mind. It looked like he had lost a lot of weight, because his face was thin and wrinkled from not living as much as it used to be, if not for the sharpness in his eyes and the flicker of something too familiar. That desperate need to get what he wants. He would have looked old. It was something she had seen before. Jason, on the other hand, was the same. The air became thick and dense because of him. It seemed like he had been waiting for years for this moment because his smile was slow and full of sarcasm. Well, Jason said in a low voice, tilting his head, look at you. Everything was set up like a little home. Almost cute. Dorothy jumped when she heard his words. To keep from shaking, she curled her fingers into her hands and dug her nails into her skin. Douglas was the one she looked at. Why? She asked through a lump in her throat. Douglas moved around uncomfortably, and his lips parted as if he were trying to find the right words. But they didn't come. Why? She asked as she stepped forward, her voice shaking and rising. How could you? After everything he did? When Douglas winced, he looked quickly at Jason and then back at her, like a scared coward. It was a sour sound that Dorothy made when she laughed, like rust and betrayal. You sold me once, and now you're back to sell me again. Douglas put his head down. That was her answer. She had always known what kind of man her dad was, but she had hoped for something small and weak. That part had just died. Jason's smile got bigger as he watched the scene. Ah, family reunions, he said with a big sigh. Always so emotional. Dorothy yelled at him. Go to hell. Jason laughed and took a slow step forward. Now, he thought, I didn't come here for you. She stopped breathing. Number? His eyes quickly moved from her to the warm house behind her. It was the babies, he said calmly. I've come to collect what's mine. Dorothy's blood froze. You son of a... Thomas moved in front of her and put himself between her and Jason before she could finish. He was like a wall, solid, unmoving, and scary. You're not taking them, Thomas said. His voice was calm, but there was something dangerous in it. Jason was amused. "Oh, come on, Shelton," he said in a low voice. "You run a business. You know how contracts work. Those kids are mine." Dorothy took things that were stolen and ran away. Thomas didn't blink. He told her, "You don't own them." Jason's face got darker. He could not hold out any longer. Jason kept talking while moving his fingers. "Tell you what," he said, "I will be kind. Dorothy is yours to keep. In any case, she's broken." He had a very sharp smirk. "But what about the kids?" "They're coming with me." Dorothy lunged. She didn't think. Not interested. She only moved her body. But Thomas grabbed her hand and stopped her before she could reach Jason. There was no control. It was for safety. His hold was firm and stable. She knew in his eyes that he would not let Jason win when he looked at her. Jason sighed and shrugged his shoulders. "Okay then. I guess this is a hard way to do it." He then swung. It took place quickly. Jason charged into the first punch. Thomas stepped back just in time to avoid being hit, and his muscles tensed up before he hit Jason in the ribs with his hand. Jason fell, but he quickly got up. He had fought all his life. Thomas had done the same. They hit each other with fists and blows, making a brutal rhythm of contact and out-of-breath fighting. Dorothy fell backwards, her heart beating fast. His men moved toward the door, but there was a bang before they got there. Someone fired a gun. "Take one more step." Donna's cool, steady voice cut through the chaos. Everyone went cold. Dorothy looked around. She stood at the top of the stairs with a shotgun pointed right at Jason's guys. Her face was hard as rock. "I just called the police," she said in a calm voice. "I'd love to see what they make of all this." He said bad words under his breath. "Upstairs," Donna told her, her eyes now fixed on Dorothy. Dorothy took off. She ran straight for the nursery and slammed the door behind her. The babies were still sound asleep. A low voice behind her said, "You should have run when you had the chance." She didn't hear it and felt safer now. Dorothy looked around. Jason stood in front of the door with a knife in his hand. It looked sharp and hungry as it shone in the dim light. Jason's eyes were filled with something dangerous and off. The sound of sirens could be heard outside, but would they get there in time? Dorothy forced a big swallow. Her body was yelling at her to move. From that point on, everything would depend on what Jason did next. I charged Jason. The blade cut through the dim light, sending a silver blur straight for Thomas's chest. Thomas just barely avoided. The knife went along his side, cutting through cloth and skin. He felt a sharp, burning heat in his ribs, but he didn't give up. However, he was also quick. Thomas fought back with a grunt and punched Jason in the gut. The crime lord fell backwards after the hit, but he didn't stay down. He came back with a bang. Dorothy was huddled in the nursery with her back against the locked door and her arms around Simon, Peter, and Shaw to keep them safe. It felt good to have their tiny bodies next to her. Their soft breathing was the only thing that kept her grounded in all the chaos. Her heart was beating fast against her ribs. It was a mess. A loud, angry roar, a blur of arms, clenched teeth, and the shine of that knife. Thomas was doing okay, but Jason fought like an animal, dirty, cruel, and unyielding. After Jason passed out, he put his arm around Thomas's throat and threw him off balance. The rich man fell hard to the ground. Thomas's words rang through the house, "Stay back," before Donna could move in. This man had a strong, clear voice that made it impossible to argue with him. Jason made a face. The knife quickly fell, and Thomas was pushed to the side by a body that moved quickly. When steel hits skin, it makes a sickening sound that cuts through the air. Everything stopped for a second. There was a scream, Donna's. Dorothy's body went stiff and her head snapped up. Then there was quiet. The world stopped for a terrible second. Dorothy was short of breath. After that, she moved without thinking about it. She quickly got up and carefully put the babies back in their cot. While she tucked the blankets around them tighter, her fingers shook. She felt like she had to stay, lock the door, and hold on to them forever. She screamed, though, and when she did that, it meant something bad had happened. Something worse. The door was open, and she walked into the hall. Her hands were shaky. It was so hot that she barely noticed the grand stairs under her feet or the cool air on her skin as she reached the landing. At the bottom of the stairs, she saw something red. There was no longer any fighting. Thomas was on the floor, squishing his ribs with his hand as he tried to get up. It was hard for him to breathe, and his face was pale. Jason stood over him with a knife in his hand. Donna was shocked and frozen. And in the middle, between Jason and Thomas, Douglas was lying still. He had a leak in his chest, and blood was pooling under him. The deep red stood out against the clean floor. His breath came out in short, uneven bursts, each one less strong than the last. Dorothy was frozen. There was nothing she could do because her mind was stuck on what she saw. Though I felt nothing, Jason's words cut through it. He said in a low voice, shame, as he swished blood off his blade. You could have let the rich guy take the blame. Old man. Dorothy felt her stomach lurch. The thought hit her like a wave of shock. Doug put himself in the way of them. He stole Thomas's knife. He had been saved by her father, the man who had left her and betrayed her many times. He was now going to die. No, before she even knew she had said it. The word pulled itself out her throat. Jason didn't even look at her for long. Don't look so shocked, sweetheart, he said in a low voice. I told you, business is business. Dorothy's legs gave out from under her. She fell down next to Douglas and put her hands on his wound, desperately trying to help him. No, no, no. Stay with me, she said in a broken voice. Why are you stupid? Why did you? Douglas's hand was shaking as he took hers. Even though his hold on her was weak, he looked at her like she was his daughter for the first time in her life, like he felt bad about what he did. He opened his mouth wide, and blood was on his teeth. I messed up, he said in a raspy voice. Dorothy tried not to cry. You think? An awful, weak smile tugged at his lips. I should have been better. Her view was cloudy from tears. Then why weren't you? A shaky breath. Because I didn't know how was the last word. His hands moved back and forth against hers. After that, they stopped moving. Dorothy took a deep breath. She hit him. No. Her voice was so sad. No, no. Don't. But his eyes were already blank. The room fell into a shattered quiet. Jason laughed and shrugged his shoulders. Well, that was dramatic. Dorothy's head jerked up. It wasn't her fault. Not hesitated. She charged. Jason had just a second to respond before she hit him hard, full of anger, hurt, and fists. She yelled, You jerk, and punched Claude and fought him. Jason growled, grabbed her by the shoulders, and pushed her back. She tripped and almost fell. But Thomas moved before he could hit again. With a powerful jump, he hit Jason hard and knocked him down. The knife slid across the marble floor as they hit the ground hard. Jason turned and swung, but Thomas moved faster. He was so angry that it was like flames. Jason tried to take the kids. Jason tried to put Dorothy out of her mind. An adult man had been killed by Jason. Thomas saw something red. He didn't fight like a businessman should have. He fought like he had something to lose. A punch. One more. His head snapped to the side, and blood came out his nose. There were sirens far away. The front door flew open. Police! Hands up! Jason went cold. After that, he cursed quietly. She stood on the stairs with her gun still in her hands. Her eyes were cold. They're coming for you. Jason's eyes were shaking. His pride broke through for the first time as doubt crept in. The front doors then flew open. The house was filled with red and blue lights. A lot of police showed up. Jason turned and got ready to run. Thomas moved faster, though. He threw Jason to the ground with a quick, violent move. The knife slid all over the floor. The police jumped on Jason, and that was the end of it. His hands were cuffed together. He felt a knee on his back. The police pulled him away. And Dorothy fell to the ground. The blood from her dad is still warm on her hands. The hospital air smelt like detergent, which was clean and cold. The fluorescent lights above hummed softly, giving the concrete floor a dull, fake glow. Everything seemed far away and quiet, like the world had slowed down to a crawl while Dorothy stayed still. She stood in the dark hallway and stared through the morgue's small window at her father's body, which was lying on a white sheet. Douglas was not there. She had been picturing this moment for a long time. She had been picturing a life where she never saw him again, and his absence would be just a thought, even a relief. She didn't feel anything now that it was real. She might have felt too much, though. She squished her fingers into the arms of her coat and held on so tight that her knuckles turned white. She was so tired that it hurt to breathe because her shoulders were so heavy. Douglas was a fool, a liar, a man who gave up his daughter to save himself. Still, Dorothy took a deep breath. Thomas was saved. He picked to die for someone else. Something had to be there, right? Her chest got tight. He made her angry. She missed him. He should rot in hell, she said. Her last wish was for him to hold her, but he never had, not even when she was a kid. She had to force herself to look away from the mortuary window because she felt sick again. It felt like she had been screaming for hours, but she never let out a sound. She could hear footsteps echoing down the hall behind her. She didn't change. She knew who it was before it happened. Thomas said in a low, calm voice, "You're here in the dark." Dorothy didn't do anything. After a short pause, there were footsteps again, this time closer. "You shouldn't be alone right now," he stated. Dorothy cracked a quiet laugh, but it wasn't funny. "I've always been alone." Thomas let out a slow, controlled breath. "Not anymore." Even though his words were easy, they held me down. She turned to face him for the first time since she got to the hospital. While Thomas had changed into new clothes, a thin bandage could still be seen under the collar of his shirt. The fight hurt him a little, but not as badly as what could have happened because of Douglas. She looked at him. Then he took a good look at him, noticing the cuts and bruises on his jaw and the tired look on his face. He needed to leave. He didn't need to stay. He was there for her, though. Dorothy's lips moved apart, but she didn't say anything because she didn't know what to say. There was a lot of sadness, anger, and uncertainty in her chest, like smoke. How could she explain it? Thomas had to have known. He didn't try. She finally broke down when he just stood there. The weight of everything was too much for her to carry by herself, so she took a slow breath out. She had lost her father, her life, and the person she used to be who thought she could get away from everything. She was worn out when Thomas quietly opened his arms. She took a step forward and let someone catch her for the first time. They didn't talk for a long time. The hospital was full of sounds and sound of life. Nurses talking to each other, machines beeping in the distance, and sometimes the sound of someone crying in another building. Everything was still in this small part of the world, though, for a short time, Dorothy let herself lean into him. His arms were steady and strong, like a base she didn't know she needed. She didn't know how long they stood there, but Thomas's voice finally hit her in the ear. "Dorothy, you're not by yourself." She closed her eyes tight. "Then why do I still feel like I am?" Thomas backed up just a little so he could look at her. He said in a low voice, "Because grief makes us all lie. It tells us we're lost, no one gets it, and there's nothing left." His look became softer. "But you're here, along with the boys, Donna and me." Dorothy took a swallow. She was going to believe him. He told her to believe him. But the pain in her chest was like a wound that wouldn't heal. Still, she took a slow, shaky breath, and that was enough for now. Leaving you hanging. The way ahead. The past was gone forever. Douglas was not there. Jared was locked up. Dorothy knew, though, that she wouldn't get better right away. The road ahead was long. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid to find out where it led as she stood next to Thomas in the quiet hospital hallway. This chapter ends on a soft but extremely heavy note, giving Dorothy time to think about what happened. The small flower shop was filled with the smell of new dirt and roses in bloom. It moved through the air like a quiet promise. The room wasn't very big, not like the big Shelton estate, but it was hers. Vases with delicate arrangements were set on the wooden shelves. The bright colors stood out against the soft cream walls. People walked by quickly on the main street, which could be seen through a big window as the sun went down. It had been 6 months since that night. It had been 6 months since she saw her dad last, since she had said goodbye to him in a whisper over his grave and then left for good. It had been 6 months since Jason was given his term and told he could never touch her kids again. After everything, Dorothy thought her life would be different. As the threat went away, her past burned down to ashes. She thought she would wake up one day and feel whole again. But healing didn't happen in a straight line. She still felt sad some days when she least expected it. Some days, she didn't even think about it. She made something new instead, something softer and more valuable. Dorothy rented this little shop on the corner of town with the money she got from Jason's settlement, which she had not asked for but still took. It wasn't much, but it kept going. It gave her a goal. It gave her a way to live. Thomas had stayed somehow. A life slowly got better. Dorothy wiped her hands clean on her apron and looked at the last flower of the day, which had peonies, white lilies, and soft green sprigs. Dorothy realized how strange it felt to be a part of someone else's happiness again as she wrapped the satin ribbon around the stems. The bride had asked for them for her wedding tomorrow. The shop doorbell rang. She knew who it was without having to look up. "You're late," she said in a low voice as she carefully set the flowers down. Thomas leaned against the bar. He looked like he had just gotten out of a meeting because his tie was a little loose and his sleeves were rolled up. His hair was a little tangled. And Dorothy wasn't sure if it was because of the wind outside or because Simon, Peter, or Sean had probably played with it before he left the house. It was easy for him to say, "Had a call run over. I miss you at home today." Dorothy smiled. "I had a business here. Donna is sure that you're working too hard. I think Donna just likes having me around to watch out for you." Thomas laughed and shook his head. You could be right. Thomas would visit her after work, bring her coffee, or just stand in the shop and watch her work. It had become a quiet pattern. At first, she thought it was duty, guilt, or responsibility, but it took a long time to stay free of guilt for 6 months. She had been left, used, and forgotten for years. She knew how it felt when someone stayed because they had to, but that wasn't the case here. There was no reason for Thomas to be tied to her life. He had a home, a job, and a life of his own. Still, he kept coming back. And every time he did, Dorothy felt like she was more than just a survivor. She was someone you should stay for. He was still there that night, after she closed the shop and walked home. When she walked inside, the house was warm, and it smelt like something was roasting in the oven. 3 little voices were laughing. 2. Dorothy stopped in the hallway, and her heart was beating too fast. Thomas was on the ground with his shirt sleeves still rolled up. His tie was gone, though. His body was at ease. Simon was sitting in his lap. Peter was leaning against his side, and Sean was talking crazy about something that only a child could understand. Thomas listened and smiled slowly as he nodded. He looked like he was born to be here and felt like he belonged. Dorothy took a swallow. She had told herself for months that her feelings for Thomas were just thanks and respect for the man who had saved her, fought for her kids, and kept her from breaking down on the worst night of her life. But she knew the truth as she stood there and watched him. It wasn't just thanks. It wasn't just happiness. It wasn't that. Something more. Something she swore she would never feel again. Thomas then looked up and caught her eye. His face changed, but he wasn't shocked or excited. He was just aware. Dorothy also thought that he might have known a long time before she did. Her fingers were tense as they touched the door frame. Just maybe this wasn't just about staying alive. It could have been love. If this resonates with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Also, share your own feelings and stories with us. Every word helps build our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a space where everyone can connect. Stay tuned for more meaningful stories on the way.